Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you as always for joining. This shir is dedicated Le'iloi Nishmas, Reb Yisrael Leib ben Yehuda Halevi, his 12th yahrzeit. He's the father of Melanie Calvert and Taryn Shonin and Gina Brodskin, husbands of Rose Shonin, and we wish them Chaim Aruchim, B'sos Tovos, and Mitzvah Hashem, this shir should be a fitting Eloi Neshama for him. So we were talking about the status of Lashon HaKodesh, of the Hebrew language, and I started off with what's probably the predominant school of thought nowadays, reflecting the sort of approach certainly of the Zohar and the later Kabbalists. Maybe not the earlier Kabbalists. I fumbled a pasuk last week. La'olam Hashem dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim. This idea that somehow the Bria as we have it, the creation as we have it, as a living embodiment of the permanence of Hashem's word, and in truth that's sort of inherent in the story in the first chapter of Ma'aseh Bereishis, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks and the world comes into existence. So you see this sort of very fundamental link between language and existence, at least the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses it. We find in Lashon HaKodesh a davar, an object has the same words described as the word words. Davar, this sort of idea that objects that exist are reflections of words that are used. So this is understanding that there's somehow an existential meaning, creative power to words, perhaps which even human beings can adopt through Kabbalistic means like Sefer Yetzirah and the like. We also find a very strong tradition that Hebrew words have existential meaning, intrinsic meaning, and they're not just arbitrary conventions. So in English, we arbitrarily label a table. A table is just evolved from a tableau in Latin or whatever it is. In Lashon HaKodesh, Shulchan somehow fundamentally embodies the nature of what this object is, and it has some sort of intrinsic and existential meaning to that. So these are, I think, a couple of the sources that we mentioned. If we look in the Kabbalim, the Zohar writes about this. It says that Lashon HaKodesh has this intrinsic meaning and intrinsic kedusha. The Maharal writes about this extensively, both in his Gur Aryeh, his sort of best-known work or most accessible work, his super commentary on Rashi, his commentary on the commentary of Rashi. He says that every nation, there's Shivim Lashon, every nation is given 70 languages, but Klal Yisrael is not amongst that list of Shivim Lashon. We are the 71st language, the 71st people, and there's an intrinsic kedusha and value to Lashon HaKodesh, in which it's not just one of the 70 languages, but he says it's nechtav, it's gozar, from a different source. It's hewn from a different source. It has a different spiritual status to this, and he brings this also in the name of the Zohar. We reflect this, by the way, in our Nusach Tefillah also, because on Tefillah of Yom Tov we say Atar Chatanu Mikol Ha'amim, Ahavto Isanu Vatzisabanu, V'Remamtanu Mikol HaLashonos. You elevated us above all languages, again seeming to indicate that Lashon HaKodesh has an intrinsic kedusha to it. I didn't mention last time, there's a Gemara Yerushalmi which seems to indicate that it's someone who engages in three practices. You live in Eretz Yisrael, one eats one's food batara, and one speaks only Lashon HaKodesh and recites Shema Erev Avoka, morning and evening, is guaranteed a place in Olam Haba. So this is sort of essential to part of the life of a frum Jew in the language of the Yerushalmi. You won't be surprised to know that Rav Kook speaks about this extensively. He saw great spiritual value in the revitalization of Lashon HaKodesh as a living language. I was asked to speak, and I can discuss it a little bit at the end, the status of modern day Vrit. Obviously, modern day Vrit has aspects of it that have been simplified from classic Lashon HaKodesh. It has words, many words, that's intrusions from foreign tongues, whether it's Arabic or Turkish or European tongues, German and English and the like. Nonetheless, at its core, it has much of Lashon HaKodesh to it. And Rav Kook certainly thought this was a very wonderful thing, that Lashon HaKodesh was being restored. He says that this is sort of the fundamental foundation or platform upon which a nation exists. The Kuzari writes about this, by the way. The Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, who was infatuated with Eretz Yisrael, he wrote the Tzion Kinnis that we say on Tisha B'Av, and himself, B'Sof Yomov, we don't know exactly what happened. It's been lost in legends exactly what happened to him. But he moved to Eretz Yisrael in those days to move from Spain, which was the central Jewish civilization and culture, to Eretz Yisrael, which was a backwater by any measure. It was an incredible act of sacrifice. Just traveling was dangerous, and he moved to Eretz Yisrael. The Kuzari speaks about a parallel between the rise and fall of the Jewish people and the rise and fall of Lashon HaKodesh. I mean, this isn't a mystical thing. This is a sort of a fact of sociology and society. As nations come and go, their languages rise and fall. So Aramaic, for example, which was the most commonly spoken language across the Middle East and very widespread, is now only really spoken by a few by Jews in when we learn Gemara, and by a few tribesmen in the mountains in the north of Iran and Iraq, the Kurdish mountains. We once actually had at our table, our Shabbos table, a PhD student who specialized in academics spoken by the Kurdish tribes. There's a few villages that still speak Aramaic in the Kurdish towns, and I always had this very romantic picture of them sitting there saying "L'may nafka mina" and "Kamash malam," but I'm told that's not exactly how modern Aramaic is spoken. It's really spoken by a very, very small amount of people because it was superseded by Arabic as the culture took over. So the same thing happens in every language, and Lashon HaKodesh in many ways was a victim of the same trends. The only thing that's in a sense unique about Lashon HaKodesh is that it survived at all. Normally a nation that loses its lands and is persecuted disappears. And the Kuzari says, just like we remains, albeit weakened, similarly Lashon HaKodesh remains, albeit weakened. So if Cook saw in the return of Lashon HaKodesh as a sort of foundational rebuilding of the structure of the Jewish people, paralleling the return to Eretz Yisrael. He says, in fact, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, in the Zos HaBracha, Hashem gave us miminoi from his right hands, from the force of giving of Hashem, Eish Das Lomo. He gave us a fiery dut, Eish Dat Lomo, Eish Das Lomo, a fiery law. So he says Eish stands for Eretz and Safa, a land and a language. So the Eish Dat Lomo, the foundation of the Dat, the law that we were given, the religion, the faith that we were given, is Eish, is Eretz Yisrael and Safa, the language of Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael and Safa Yisrael, the language of Israel. So he saw this as his son, by the way, writes a remarkable idea. He says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent us the Chafetz Chaim, to restore the purity of our speech, to regenerate interest. The Chafetz Chaim we think of the Chafetz Chaim as a tzaddik. He was a tzaddik, but he was a remarkable Gan in Torah. He was an incredible genius in Torah. I mean, you look at the Mishnah Berurah and the Biur Halacha and the vast mastery of halacha that he had. This doesn't need to be said. But the Chafetz Chaim, besides being a sort of Mussar work, which was reminding people about the restoration of Lashon Hara, was a halachic work in which he did something really unprecedented. He scoured classic sources and created a new Shulchan Aruch, effectively. It was an area that wasn't that much touched by earlier poskim. And he did a work that normally was carried out sort of, the systemization of halacha was carried out 5 centuries earlier. You know, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah, those were the generations when all the collation of the vast amounts of information in spread across Gemara and Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi and Tosefta and Sifra and Sifri and Midrashim, it was all collated, and the thoughts of the Rishonim was all collated into halachic works. Mishnah Berurah did that with Chafetz Chaim. So a Cook's son, Tzvi Yehuda, said that he felt that Hashem sent the Chafetz Chaim as purifying our language, our national consciousness of Lashon Hara, of speech, in order to prepare us for the restoration of Lashon HaKodesh. You can't have Lashon HaKodesh spoken, Hebrew spoken again as a living language, if people are going to speak Lashon Hara, and therefore the Chafetz Chaim raised consciousness of Lashon Hara in advance of the restoration of the return to Tzion and the restoration of Lashon HaKodesh. These are very, very fascinating and powerful ideas, which have very strong basis in our Masorah. And I mentioned also, I think last week, I did discuss this, that this reaches halachic literature also. So we saw halachic discussions around speaking Lashon HaKodesh in the bathroom. You're allowed to speak, you're not meant to speak Torah in the bathroom, you're allowed to speak to Vichol. They used to bathe in bathhouses. It used to be a meeting of intellectuals. The literary salons of the sort of 5th century Bovel were in the bathhouses, or even actually 3rd century Eretz Yisrael. We find this Tanoim also, and they used to speak, but they weren't allowed to speak Torah there. They could speak philosophy, they could speak history and politics, but they weren't allowed to speak Torah. And the post can discuss a havamina that you can't speak kol in Lashon HaKodesh because someone speaking it in Hebrew imbues it with a kedusha. We saw the idea of speaking kol on Shabbos, and if it said the Ramah, if it said in Lashon HaKodesh, then that might be different. So we saw various reading secular materials on Shabbos, we saw various halachic ramifications of this discussion, this idea that somehow Lashon HaKodesh has an intrinsic kedusha to it. What I'm now going to do is look at the alternate sources which seem to view Lashon HaKodesh very differently. And they view it as a language amongst a family of languages, which evolves like all languages do. And we can see this. We can trace some changes in Lashon HaKodesh across the Tanakh. And most significantly, by the time we get to much later periods in history, the Lashon Mishnah, the Rambam already writes about this, the Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew of Mishnah, is somewhat different to the Hebrew of Tanakh. It's not radically different. You can cross-understand the two. It's not a different language in any way, but it changes a little bit. And certainly if we get to Rabbinic Hebrew, the language of the Rishonim, there was a very conscious changes made to the language, particularly actually as the development of philosophy occurred, in which words that we treat very much as Lashon HaKodesh today were coined in a sense by the Golem and the Rishonim to become abstract words of philosophical intent. So a very different picture from the Rishonim, from some sources, as Lashon HaKodesh being a natural language, part of a family of languages that evolves like natural languages, and was simply the ethnic language spoken by our ancestors as inhabitants of Eretz Canaan. This is a very different school of thought. Now, I'm going to argue in brief to give the punchline away. I'm going to argue two things. The first thing I'm going to argue is that certainly for those of us that I've spoken before about the history of the ancient Near East, and we've looked at some of the research around this. I've said again and again that one has to read many of these sources as a slightly critical consumer and realize that historians and researchers, we're talking about a field in which there's very few practitioners, and the job of the researchers and historians are to tell a narrative and a story based on what evidence they have. And at the end of the day, there's a paucity of evidence when you're talking that far back. So we do need to be careful in over-reliance. Nonetheless, as far as we understand, and this is the consensus of academics in many fields, in linguistics and in semantics and in literature and in archaeology and in history, it would appear that Lashon HaKodesh is a Semitic language, part of a family of Semitic languages, a first cousin of Aramaic, a second cousin of Arabic, all of which seem to have developed from a proto-language which was above all of them. Certainly, if one, and I'm not arguing that one should, but for those that are interested and read academic history and literature, the model of Lashon HaKodesh as being this God-given language that appeared yesh me'ayin, somewhere from nowhere, and is radically different to all other languages, intrinsically and inherently and fundamentally, is a difficult idea, at least in line with the academic understanding. Now again, it's possible the other way around. I mentioned last week a Rosh that says that Aramaic is Lashon HaKodesh Meshubash, that Lashon HaKodesh was the original mother tongue, and that Aramaic is the language that developed and evolved out of it. So I'm not taking sides here in academic debates which are well above my ability. I'm simply saying that there is a significant school of thought, which we will shortly see, which isn't bothered by any of this. It's perfectly comfortable with the idea that Lashon HaKodesh is a language amongst a family of languages which evolved and developed like many languages and which behaves like you would expect a normal language to behave, and in many respects is simply the language spoken by our ancestors, by the family of Shem and Ava and the others. So this is an alternative view, and certainly one that deserves to be known by those who struggle with understanding how our sources fit in with some of the research around the ancient world. I am then going to argue, as I really argue so often in these series, that as radically different as these two approaches sound, they are divided by a hair's breadth. And actually, they both come to the same conclusion. No one should have a problem with Romam Tonu Mikol Lashon, with the idea that Lashon HaKodesh is a Lashon of Kedusha, a language of sanctity, and it simply yet again reflects two very different approaches to Yiddishkeit that are nonetheless one. We belong to one faith, one Judaism, and as radical as these divides sound, they share very, very significant and important commonalities. They're not radically different, and we see this so often in our learning together. Really, one of the agendas of this of these philosophy series that we do is actually to try and show that both paths represent a real meaningful path in Avodas Hashem. We don't need to be afraid of what sounds like a cold and sort of philosophical and academic approach around these matters. So this will be the agenda for today. Before I start, though, I'll simply say, as a matter of history, we are certainly aware of the developments in Lashon HaKodesh in more recent times, and I mentioned this already. The Rishonim consciously chose to coin words which have become very popular words in Lashon HaKodesh, and are used a lot actually in Kabbalah and Machshava and other things. And these were created words by the Rishonim. We know the history of these words. So, for example, existence as an abstract concept in Lashon HaKodesh is mitzius or mitziot, the mitzius of something. Now, the development of this world, we know exactly when it was formed. We know it was created by the philosophical Rishonim to describe the abstract concept of existence. Existence is philosophically a very profound and not a simple concept at all. Does the word existence add anything more to just the state of being of everything being around? When I say something exists, am I adding to it? If I say there's a tree and this tree exists, am I saying anything more about it? So these are ideas that are discussed in epistemology and what it means to know and what it means to make statements about things. But the Rishonim coined this word existence. We know how they developed it. There's the word motzah, to find something, or lahotzi, to go out. In other words, the going out. And they took this word going out and they said mitzius, the going outness of things, the foundness of things. And mitzia, hashava saveta, is you find something which is lost. So the mitzius is the findingness of things and the existence of things. They took it and made a word out of a verb, motzah, to find, the state of findingness, which is the word mitzius, which is existence itself. Sorry.
Famously, because Hebrew doesn't have a verb to be, does it? I don't know whether it's unique in that way or whether others.
Yeah, that is right. The Hebrew doesn't have a verb to be. I don't know about other Semitic languages, but yeah, absolutely. So the Rishonim had to coin a word when they wanted to, as they began engaging in conversation with philosophies that were very different to Judaism and became part of a sort of a global conversation of things, and had to work out how to say Torah ideas in the language of the philosophers, which was foreign to the way of Jewish thinking initially. These words had to be found. There's another very common word, teva, nature. So you'll hear much about teva, including gematrias linked with the word teva and things like that. Now again, we know that teva was a created word. The origin of the word teva, I spoke about coining words. The origin of the word teva actually has had a double evolution. We have the word sunken. We say it in the Shira, tovu bayom, they sunk in the sea, or embedded in the sea, immersed in the sea, which became matbeah, which is a coin or a stamp, because a coin is embossed as a form sunken into it, stamped into it. And that in turn was used by the Rishonim to develop into the word teva, which means nature or natural law, because natural law is somehow stamped into existence. The world runs in certain well-trodden paths, in certain ruts and in certain channels, which are embossed or embedded into the functioning of the universe, and these are the laws of nature. So this became the word teva, the laws of nature. So we have tovaf, to sunk, going to a matbeah, a coin, and a stamp, embossing something into the word teva, which means the laws of nature. And again, these are well-known things. So certainly in the times of Chazal and the times of the Rishonim, they were coining words in Lashon HaKodesh to meet their needs. This wasn't a new endeavor by Ben Yehuda or by the foundation of modern Hebrew. That's what happens in languages. Words shift in their meanings over time to cope with new concepts and new ideas. So how are we meant to make sense of this, and what are the sources we know about this? So there is, as with so much else, a Rambam in his Moed Nevuchim. This is in the third Chelek of the Rambam, in Chelek Gimel of the Rambam Moed Nevuchim, in Perek Ches. And the Rambam says, you know why Lashon HaKodesh is Lashon HaKodesh? Do you know what makes it Kodesh? It is because it is a language out of which have been removed coarseness, crudity, lack of refinement. It is a refined language. It is an edel language. It is a sensitive language. It's a language in which no words exist for the lower aspects of human existence, the lower aspects of human relationships. Torah uses euphemisms when it wishes to refer to spousal relationships, when it wishes to refer to body parts associated with that. Torah Lashon HaKodesh has become a refined language out of which crudity and inappropriateness and that which is overly physical and corrosive has been removed from Lashon HaKodesh. So says the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim. Now, as you can imagine, this, as with so much else in the Rambam's Guide to the Text, a storm arose following the Rambam's words. The Rambam, as with so much else, was aware that Lashon HaKodesh was very similar to Arabic and Aramaic, and he didn't have access to modern tools of scholarship. He had the sense that this was a language amongst languages, and he said this is what is unique about Lashon HaKodesh. Now, I appreciate this sounds at this stage quite shocking. What are we meant to make of this? And we will get back to this. But many of the contemporaries of the Rambam found this shocking and were horrified by this. It's very interesting, by the way, the Ritva, so we're talking here about 4 generations after the Rambam. The Ritva wrote is most famous for a very, very important sefer of commentary on the Gemara Chedushei Ritva. He also has some works on philosophy and Agadah, and he wrote a sefer called Sefer HaZikaron, in which he defends everything the Rambam wrote. The history behind this is that the Ritva was, just very briefly to sort of put this in context, there were waves of retreat and response to the Rambam, and near the end of the life of the Rambam, the first sorts of waves of enormous controversy against the Rambam arose. The Rambam was aware that there were people that disagreed with him, very aware of this because there were letters backwards and forwards, and he was aware of intense debate, but he died before the first really strong and vicious attacks against him happened. So he was already on, but immediately after the death of the Rambam and on, there was very, very significant attack against the Rambam. There were times when these attacks became deadly serious, quite literally. Jews were fighting Jews. There were stories in which towns were split, families were split, particularly in Provence, which I've mentioned before on many occasions. Provence is the south of France. It's the border between Arabic-speaking Spain and Northern Europe. Very, very important Jewish community at the time with very, very great scholars in it. And it's the place where Spanish refugees had arrived. The Rambam, don't forget, ran away from Spain because of Muslim fundamentalism. And some of the refugees ran to Provence. They were Arabic speaking. They translated the Rambam's works, made them accessible to the rest of the Jewish world, many of whom weren't part of Spanish speaking philosophical culture. Terrible conflicts dividing Provence. Conflicts, when they happen, are devastating for the Jewish world. They leave everyone feeling disillusioned. They leave the laity saying, well, if the rabbis are behaving like this, what do we know about what's going on? And in their worst cases, like let's say with the Hasidim and the Snagdim in the debate, it can even end up with Jew reporting Jew to the secular authorities and accusing each other of heresy. Don't forget the Christians at the time are fundamentalists themselves, and they're watching all of this both with glee. And if someone reports that the other side is saying heresy, they're quite happy and interested to get involved in all of this. So there's a terrible wave of argument, and senior figures like the Ramban step in and try and bring peace and try and calm things down and promote compromise from both sides. Now, the Ramban is a first cousin of Rabbeinu Yonah, who we know for the Sha'arei Tshuva, but who at the earliest stage of his life was a fierce critic of Rambam, of Maimonides, and got very caught up in arguments. He later retreated from this fierce criticism and realized he had gone too far and wrote his Sha'arei Tshuva, according to legends, as a sort of response, a teshuva response to having gone too far. The Ramban gets involved and tries to broker compromise. The Ramban is respected really by everyone. You can't not respect the Ramban. He's such a towering figure. He writes to the Baalei Tosfos in the north, because he is a Talmud of the Ashkenazim in the north, in London, and he says, you have to understand, Spain is different, the Rambam is different. I realize what the Rambam writes sounds really foreign and strange to French and German ears in the world of the Baalei Tosfos, the Rambam was a Yorei Shemaim, and he wrote to promote Yiras Shemaim, and he writes to the Mekabolim in Spain and says, tone down your attacks, and he writes to the philosophers, because the Ramban is also a philosopher, and says, stop your attacks against the Mekabolim and stop saying the more extreme philosophical ideas, you've gone too far, and he tries to promote peace. The Ritva is a grand Talmud of the Ramban. So the Ritva is a Talmud of the Rashba, who himself is a Talmud of the Ramban. So the Ritva is part of that culture in which there's an attempt to reintegrate the Rambam back into what's becoming ever more a Kabbalistic world, and show that the Rambam is not too, we can understand and we can live with the Rambam. We shouldn't be banning his work, even if there are things that we disagree with. So the Ritva wrote a sefer called Sefer Zikaron, in which he defends the views of the Rambam. But there's one view he finds untenable to defend, and this is the Rambam's view on Lashon HaKodesh. So it's fascinating. Out of all the ideas in the Mona V'chem, which we've discussed many of them over the years here in this forum, out of all of these views, the one that the Ritva himself raises his hands in despair and says, I just don't know what to do with this, is the view of the Rambam in Lashon HaKodesh. Again, though, I'm going to suggest that as radical as the Rambam is in this respect, we need not be afraid of it. And there's very, very important messages that we can identify, very important ideas that we can identify here in the Rambam. But let's look at what the Ramban has to say on the matter. And I want to stress here, as I'm saying this, the Ramban is representing what we would think of as the school of the Mekabolim. The Ramban is representing the counter position to the Rambam, and yet to the modern ears, it's not so radically different. And this is what's interesting about this. To the ears that we've been brought up on, with the Maral's view and the Rav Kook view that I shared, and to some degree the Kuzari and the Zohar, that see this intrinsic, fundamental yesh me'ayin, something from nothing creation of Lashon HaKodesh. The Rambam doesn't say any of that. The Rambam says, do you know what Lashon HaKodesh is? It's Lashon Canaan. It's the language spoken by the inhabitants of Canaan. But there's a pasuk which refers to Lashon HaKodesh in that respect. He says it's the language that was spoken by the inhabitants of Canaan. What makes it Kadosh? Because it's the language of Torah, it's the language of prophecy, it's the language that Hashem communicated to human beings in Nevuah, it's the language in which the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are expressed, it's the language which Hashem used to create the universe. He named the Malachim, the angels, with this language. Tzaddikim are named in this language. That is what makes Lashon HaKodesh Kodesh. Again, let's listen again to what the Ramban said. The Ramban said that Lashon HaKodesh, he's coming to argue with the Rambam. He says what the Rambam says about it just being because it doesn't have crudity and profanity in it and things like that, that's a simply insufficient explanation of what the Holy Tongue is. It's holy because it was used by Hashem to communicate to human beings. It's the language of the Nevuah, it's the language of Torah, it's the language of Malachim, it's the language of prophecy, it's the language in which Hashem speaks to us and addresses us. It's the language of Canaan that the inhabitants of Canaan spoke at the time, which has been used by Hashem as Lashon HaKodesh. We're going to have to work out what that means in a minute. So it's interesting that the Ramban, representing the school of Kabbalists, does not say it's this language that came from nowhere. He recognizes it as a normal language spoken by normal people. And by the way, there's a lot of indication to this, and the Ramban mentions some of this. Let's think about the story of Yosef and his brothers. So the brothers come down to Mitzrayim. Yosef puts an interpreter there to communicate between him, who speaks ostensibly only speaks Egyptian, and the brothers who only speak, well, presumably Lashon HaKodesh. And there's an interpreter there speaking. And they don't know, according to the Medrash at least, this interpreter is one of the sons of Moshe, of Yosef. And Yosef really is listening to their conversation, and they don't know that either because they don't realize it's Yosef. Now, when they come down, who's speaking Lashon HaKodesh at the time? Just one family with one father, Yaakov, and 12, sadly now 11 children? Is this a spoken tongue? Why is there an interpreter in the court of Yosef and Paro for a language spoken by 13 people or 70 souls, let's say, by the time they get down to Mitzrayim? In other words, is that really what Lashon HaKodesh is? Or is this the language spoken by Canaan? This is the language of, in other words, is this a model in which Lashon HaKodesh is only spoken by Yaakov and his family? So, and the Ramban sort of makes it, he makes this point, and he mentions this and various other things. It clearly is a spoken language. So the model that we have, in which we somehow see it as radically different to all other languages, evidently something's going on over here. We've misunderstood something a little bit. And what I want to argue simply is that what sounds like two very different ways of looking at Lashon HaKodesh are really one and the same. And I've alluded to this already when I spoke about the development and evolution of Lashon HaKodesh. I think what the Ramban is saying over here is that Lashon HaKodesh is a tongue amongst tongues, at least initially, at least fundamentally, at least in and of in itself. It's a Semitic language spoken by Semites or even Canaanites, maybe in that part of the world. But what makes Kedusha isn't the raw material that you are given. What makes Kedusha and sanctity is what you do with that raw material and how you develop it and how you mold it. Do we need to be afraid with the thought that Lashon HaKodesh is Lashon Canaan, that the Canaanites, the Bnei Chom, spoke Lashon HaKodesh? Should that frighten us? Well, we have a problem, because Eretz Yisrael, Eretz HaKodesh, the sticks and stones also belonged to the Canaanim. The raw material of Eretz Yisrael, the stones, the dust, the earth, was also belonged to Canaan once upon a time. What makes it Eretz HaKodesh, what makes it Eretz Yisrael, is what we do with it, how we use it, the potential that it has, the qualities that it possesses. Lashon HaKodesh is the same thing. Lashon HaKodesh is Lashon Canaan in the language of the Ramban. It's a Semitic language spoken by Semites in that part of the world, but molded and formed into a language of Kedusha. And again, let me use an analogy from the secular realm and then Lashon HaKodesh itself, and then go back to the point that we're making. If you wanted to speak philosophy or science in the year 1600, 1500 in Europe, you really only had one language to do this in, which was Latin. Latin was the only language that had the vocabulary and the terms that was sophisticated enough to do that. If you move forward to the year 1700s, there's now another language you could do it in, which was French. You couldn't really speak science or abstract philosophy in English. It just didn't have the developed vocabulary and language. Fast forward to the year 2022, and the best language in the world to speak science and philosophy in is English, because for all sorts of reasons that we're not going to go into, English has become the language which is the spoken tongue of philosophy and science, and has developed a vast vocabulary with nuanced and sophisticated and subtle meaning to express very, very complicated ideas in science and philosophy. With the best will in the world, if you come from a culture very far removed from that, I know nothing about the languages spoken in Zimbabwe or Nigeria or whatever it may be. These are languages that simply don't have a vocabulary to express sophisticated, modern scientific ideas, because the language simply hasn't been developed in that way. It just hasn't been given that vocabulary. It hasn't had, again, for whatever reasons, a critical mass of scientists and philosophers and so on. And therefore, if you're a student living there and you want to study these things, you have to speak English, and you have to do that. And you will struggle to translate these ideas into your own language, because the vocabulary hasn't been developed. We mold and develop languages constantly for our needs and for the needs of our society and the world within which we live. There may be languages that are very sophisticated expression of abstract ideas in Hinduism or Buddhism, for which English would be wholly unsuitable to express. But English has developed over the last 200 years into a language very, very well developed for expressing ideas in science or philosophy. I have no idea if this is true or not, but supposedly in some of the Eskimo languages, there are multiple words for different sorts of snow. The point isn't whether it's true or not. The point is that people believe it's true. In other words, it's the sort of language you'd expect to be molded. We all intuitively understand that languages develop to express the points of interest and need in their language for what they're meant to do. What the Ramban is arguing over here is that Lashon HaKodesh may have started off life as a raw language spoken by the people at the time, and it was molded by the master molder, the master craftsman, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, no less, into a language which is a fitting receptacle for Inyonei Kedusha, for sanctity. It's the language best equipped to communicate Jewish ideas. Well, obviously, it's the Jewish tongue. It's the language of the Torah. It's the language best developed to communicate Torah ideas, prophecy, Nevuah ideas. HaKadosh Baruch Hu used it to name the Malachim, to give himself name, the Shemus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to name the Tzaddikim, as the Ramban says. He used it to communicate and speak to people in the language of Nevuah, the language of prophecy. HaKadosh Baruch Hu molded the language into a vehicle of Kedusha, in the same way as he molded Eretz Yisrael into a land of Kedusha, and he molded us as a people of Kedusha. He took ideas for the Eskimo snow may be important. For England in the 21st century, certain type of technical languages, science and so on is an important, or financial vehicles is an important thing to speak about. And for Klal Yisrael, the language was molded into a vehicle of Kedusha to communicate and carry Torah and Kedusha ideas. And therefore, it's no surprise that this is the language best suited to express Kedusha ideas. And just like you'll have trouble translating sophisticated financial language ideas or philosophical or scientific ideas into a language which can't carry it, similarly, we will struggle to translate items of Kedusha into any other language. And with the best will of the translators, the translation will always be a translation and not the language which can carry the Kedusha in the same way as saying Lashon HaKodesh for Torah or for Tefillah ideas. Sorry, Neil.
So how would the Rambam understand that the initial concept that Lashon HaKodesh existed maybe before time, the world with it,
yes,
that there is some intrinsic, so maybe adopted by Kabbalists afterwards, but to have that power, it has to have that before it existed in raw material, then changing it, adopting it post that time because it has to exist before people.
I don't know. I assume that the Ramban means, much like we say about Torah itself as being there Kodem before the creation of the world, means there's an abstract concept of a language which is a vehicle of communication. Look, when in Sefer Gracious we talk about Vayom Hashem Yi'ar, etc., what we are saying is there's some communication between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the physical universe, or what will develop into the physical universe, in which we express through the metaphor of spoken language. I mean, who's he speaking to? He's speaking to creation itself. So there's some form of interaction which we best express through the metaphor of language. Why is language a good metaphor for this? So the Maharal already explains this. Thought remains internal. Action is achieving results through physical movement. Language is the best analogy we have of how thought expressed externally can achieve results, and yet not through direct physical action. And that, yes. We don't know what they spoke. We don't know what they spoke. We don't really understand it. But, and it may be that Lashon HaKodesh had always within it a unique potential for spirituality, but in and of itself, there is a let's do a thought experiment for a moment. Had the first person to recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a manner in which Avram recognized, being an inhabitant of Central America in Aztec world, so what would the Am HaNivcha looked like then? So that very concept in some schools of thought is a sort of a terrible thing to even reflect upon. But certainly if we go with this line of thought, a remarkable figure would have arisen in Central America, Aztec or Inca world, would have had an equivalent of a Nimrod type story, would have battled the powers that be, the elite, the conventions at the time, and been an Ivri, a lone voice arguing, and eventually would have created a people, a family that recognized HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in that world, presumably, a part of that landscape which was spiritually suited. We've spoken before about Eretz Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael having within it this sort of potential to be the critical area for the revelation of spirituality. It's a very central place. It's a link between the continents. It's a crossroads of civilization. Has a very varied climate from the snow in the Hermon in the north to the deserts in the south. It's therefore fitting. It's got the right balance of enough prosperity that a Jewish civilization can flourish there, but not enough prosperity. It's Loika Eretz Mitzrayim, as the Pasuk says, where you can lose your relationship with Hashem. So presumably there could have been a patch in Central America that perhaps had similar properties that could have become a holy land in its own right, and the language spoken at the time would have been molded and morphed into a fitting vehicle for Kedusha. Now all of this is only, sorry? Yes. Yes. So this is why I said a Mamin in the form of Avram, because there was something unique about Avram's emunah or his relationship to Hashem that differed, despite their greatness, from the Kedusha of Shem or Noach or Ava. Now, Chazal already speak about what this is. For Avram, it wasn't just an abstract belief. They say he had Daladama Shal Halacha. He realized that emunah had to be expressed in action. He engaged in chesed, he engaged in outreach. And so for now, I'm not going into what was unique in Avram. There's something unique about Avram, different to the spirituality that has existed before in Noach and Shem and all the other great figures. So for our thought experiment purposes, I'm simply saying, imagine that figure would have arisen somewhere else. I'm not even arguing that this is in practice possible, because you're absolutely right. Avram is a descendant of Shem. Even Avram didn't come from nowhere. He's a product of being the family of Shem. But the purpose of my thought experiment is not to suggest, I actually have no idea about this, whether there couldn't have been an Avram somewhere else. So really, it's an interesting question. But the purpose of my thought experiment is like all imagines history, isn't to go into the complexities of whether this could or couldn't have been, but simply to say that there was a figure that arose that has a unique relationship with Ruchnius and with Emunah, different somehow in all sorts of interesting ways that we can talk about to Shem and Noach and Adam and everyone else. And out of that was carved and formed an Am HaNivcha. By the way, if you want a Maramokum on this, I mentioned recently in our Parsha, I can't remember in the context, the Chassid Yaivet. So in the year 1492, as we know, Spanish Jewry was expelled from Spain and eventually Portugal. And one of the leaders of the sort of that generation, the next generation, was someone called the Chassid, he was known as Chassid Yaivet. He's given the title Chassid because he was a Chassid. He was seen as an exceptionally pious person. And he was one of the central figures in leading Spanish Jewry to self-reflection about perhaps having gone too far philosophically, and that leading to a coldness in its Yiddishkeit and a lack of warmth and energy. I don't think we discussed that a while back. And the Chafetz Yaivetz writes about this. He writes, I once saw in his Perush and Big Others, he says Avram is a unique figure, perhaps in the whole history of humanity. In fact, he writes this explicitly. He says had Avram not chosen HaKodesh Baruch Hu, there could have been another 2 or 3 people in history that maybe could have achieved that title. Very interesting. And if we believe in Bechira, what would have happened had an Avram Avinu chosen not to recognize Hashem, chosen to not be thrown into the fire, chosen to ignore any one of the 10 nisyonos? Again, a very interesting a thought experiment. Had it got to Lech Lecha and Avram said, that's too much, I'm not leaving my family, or got to that Kedar, I've got to be 9 nisyonos, but number 10 is just too much for me. So presumably, Klal Yisrael wouldn't have become Klal Yisrael in exactly the way it would have. Had he not entered into the bris ben Absarim, had he not become a covenantal partner of Hashem. So what would have happened? The Chafetz Yaivetz mentions this, and I assume it's obvious in many ways. There's been another Avram type figure that would have, there can no longer be an Avram, because there's already been an Avram. So future spiritual giants have to become different types of things. They have to become a Yitzchak or a Yaakov. And Tessa speaks about this. He says the challenge of Yitzchak's spirituality is not to be a carbon copy of his father, because that's no skill. The challenge of Yitzchak is what's the next generational job to do. But had there not been an Avram, then maybe a Yitzchak could have been an Avram, or maybe someone else, and maybe our imagined figure in the Aztec or Inca Empire could have been that. So it's just a thought experiment to bring out that the second model of Lashon HaKodesh is okay with seeing it as a normal language, one crafted and molded. We don't know exactly when in history, we don't know in what way, we don't know how it happens, but crafted and molded into a vehicle of Kedusha, and that's what makes it Kodesh. It's the language that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has used to speak to human beings. Yeah.
Is it consistent with other series you've given? And then secondly, saying that Lashon is kind of refinement of the other language.
Yes.
It's similar with Torah. You compare the Hammurabi code, other codes. Again, the Torah was kind of refinement.
It's absolutely.
The Mishkan was a refinement on what the Egyptians did. So
it is a consistent theme. I'm pleased I'm being consistent over here, but for those online, absolutely right. For those that heard my series on the Mishkan as being a refinement of, this is the view of the Rambam in Mo Nevuchim again and again. And I want to stress, to me, this has a fierce and passionate and burning spirituality. This is not a cold piece of philosophy. It's a wonderful worldview. It's taking a human language, it's telling us what it means to be a Jew. It's to take a human being. We are made of the same flesh and blood as every other human on planet Earth. And Hashem gives us a task, and he says, make yourselves into spiritual beings. We are, it's consistent with what we said about Hammurabi's codes and the refinement of that. Many years ago, I gave a very in-depth series on evolution, so I'm not going to go into the subject of evolution, the wrongs and rights of it. Is it true, isn't it true? But in and of in itself, as Rav Hirsch points out, as Rav Kook points out, and others, were we to accept the truth of evolution, without going into we should or we shouldn't, but if we are to accept it, should this bother us that we are made of animal matter? Well, no, the Torah tells us that. It tells us we have a side of ourselves that's capable of animalistic behavior in the extreme, and we have a neshama. We have been given by Kadosh Baruch Hu, Tzelem Elokim, and it's now our job to develop ourselves and choose which way we want to go. And in this model, Lashon HaKodesh is an exact metaphor, parallel of what it means. Human beings develop languages, we learn to speak to each other, and at some point in the development of our language, we face a choice. Are we only going to speak to ourselves? Are we only going to speak to others? Or are we also going to try and speak to our Kadosh Baruch Hu? And Baruch Hashem, thank God, Hashem reciprocates and he speaks back to us. And we have this partnership in which a conversation starts between us and our Kadosh Baruch Hu. And we develop ever better ability to speak to our Kadosh Baruch Hu and to hear him in return. And this is what Lashon HaKodesh is. It's the creation of a language through a partnership between human beings and HaKadosh Baruch Hu to create a vehicle of communication and to hear the words of divine. And that is what we mean by Kedusha. That is what sanctity is. It's the elevation of, it's the elevation of the physical into the spiritual. And I want to stress again, this is a partnership because HaKadosh Baruch Hu took Lashon HaKodesh, human language, and made it into something spiritual, and we in turn have continued to develop it. We've enhanced it as a vehicle for Kedusha and for communication. As I said, Metzias and Teva and so many other words which the Rishonim coins, because the spirituality of their times demanded a new expression or continued or developed expression of Lashon HaKodesh into an ever engaged vehicle of Kedusha. The Rishonim, the Gaonim, who chose to express ideas of ruchnius and spirituality in the language of philosophy, for whatever reason, in their great vision of sanctity, saw that philosophy was a language that now was the appropriate vehicle to express ideas in Yiddishkeit, and they elevated philosophy. Again, however much the Rambam got from Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, he was no Plato, he was no Aristotle, he was a Mamin, he was an Evet Hashem. He took, for whatever reason, he chose that vehicle, it spoke to him, he saw in it depth, he saw in it a clarity of thought. He used it as a vehicle to express the timeless truths of Torah as he understood them, and therefore that him, along with many other Rishonim and Gaonim who use that, developed Lashon HaKodesh to become a vehicle to ever continually express ruchnius and to express spirituality and kedusha. And again, this is in a sense the same as the project of the Rambam to elevate philosophy. This is way of thinking in which we see it as our ever ongoing task to work out how to communicate, and it's a perfect metaphor for this struggle of human existence in which we are finite humans desperately trying to catch whatever we can of the infinite and engage with it. So I'm arguing over here that the machlokas between the Ramban and the Rambam is in a sense a small one. Is the Kedusha just the removal of profanity and crudity? The Ramban hates that. He says this is terrible, this view of the Rambam. There's just the removal of profanity and so on. Of course, it's the embedding and the imbuing into Lashon HaKodesh as a vehicle of sanctity and Kedusha. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. We are simply humans. The idea even of Hashem having a language is inherently ridiculous. Because Baruch doesn't have a mouth, he doesn't have a tongue, he doesn't carve words into shape. He lives he lives as much as we can use language. We've spoken about the struggle of us to communicate. All communication, when we're talking about the infinite, is borrowed terminology. We spoke about Dibra Torah Koloshim B'nei Adam, that the Torah speaks in the language of human beings. Mitzvahs are vehicles or channels for us to connect to the divine. There are interesting questions to know. What was the experience of a Novi? In which language did the Novi experience the communication of Hashem? The presumable answer is in whatever language they spoke. Bilam presumably had HaKadosh Baruch Hu initially in Aramaic at least. If Bilam was Lavan, Yagar Sadusa, he was an Aramaic speaker. When Nevi'im heard HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the language, there's even sources, and this is a topic for the next year, but there's a Radak and a Babin and others that discuss this idea that Nevi'im whose mastery of Lashon HaKodesh wasn't the best, heard the communication of Nevuah in their flawed Lashon HaKodesh. Meaning if a Novi made a diktuk mistake or had a more limited vocabulary, Chazal already talk about this, different Nevi'im having more limited vocabulary, better Lashon HaKodesh, more sophisticated Lashon HaKodesh, and they communicated there. You just need to look at the Nevi'im and you see that they spoke different languages of different uses of Lashon HaKodesh, reflecting different life journeys or different experiences or different personalities. They heard, Moshe Rabbeinu is the exception, right? Moshe Rabbeinu is cleansed of any personal element, but his successors as Nevi'im and their successors as Chachamim, as human beings, they heard Torah, and they heard it in their purified and rarefied manner, but in the vehicle, in the receptacle that was them as people. And therefore, I'm arguing that we don't need to be afraid of this. V'romamtonu Michol Loshen is something that the Rambam could say as much as the Ramban, as much as the Zohar, as much as the Maral, as much as Rav Kook. We can all say V'romamtonu Michol Loshen. There's simply, Lashon HaKodesh is Lashon HaKodesh, it's a holy tongue. There's simply, as in so many other instances, a difference of approach as to where Kedusha comes from. Was it something created from nothing, or can we live with it being a human language because we are human beings who have developed ruchnius and developed spirituality? Sorry, Leonard, you were waiting for me. Yes.
So it seems to be there's a Lashon HaKodesh there.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Lashon HaKodesh is very, very central, and Chazal speak about this in the way the Torah uses this. The Ramban's objection to the Rambam is that he's saying that that's all that there is to Kedusha, just the negative. It's a bit parallel, by the way, to the idea of Kabbalists again, in which the Rambam sees it as avoiding the negative. Sacrifice is about avoiding the sort of pagan area of it, and the Ramban says no, we need to find something positive in it. But neither of them in Derech HaPshat, neither of them are bothered by this being a human way of drawing close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're physical, tangible human beings. In truth, in Avodas Hashem, do we need to take a living animal and see its blood and its gore to connect to Hashem? We shouldn't, but we do, because we're physical human beings who live in a physical world and a physical body, and that's what we need. That's what we need to live. By the way, just for the completion, and then I'll stop for today. The latest source I could find that source that speaks about this explicitly is the Chasam Sofer. Again, the Chasam Sofer, we're not talking about philosophical sources. The Chasam Sofer, who's very much a reflection of the mindset of the Kabbalim, he speaks about this issue of Yosef and his brothers who come down, in which Yosef says to his brothers, "You should know I'm Yosef. Kipi hamadab aleichem. It is my mouth speaking to you." Says Rashi, what do you mean, Kipi hamadab aleichem? My mouth speaking to you. I'm speaking to you in Lashon HaKodesh. So you know I must be Yosef. Ask the Chasam Sofer. I don't understand. There's an interpreter there in court who was already speaking to them. This is the language spoken by the inhabitants of the area. What does Yosef mean when he says I must be Yosef? Says the Chasam Sofer, the Lashon HaKodesh, the Ivrit, the Hebrew, the Canaanite, spoken by Yaakov and his sons, was completely different to the Canaanite spoken by everyone else. It's the same language, it was the same vocabulary, but one was used as a vehicle for Kedusha and the other one wasn't. When you knew how to speak the native Hebrew tongue, which maybe thousands, 100,000 people spoke in Canaan at the time, but when you're a Yosef, you speak it differently. I'm speaking to you as a Yosef with the use of Lashon HaKodesh as a vehicle for Kedusha, with the sensitivity and a refinement and a sanctity. I'm speaking in the language of Nevi'im. We shouldn't see any contradiction between an awareness which the Chasam Sofer was comfortable with, which the Rambam was comfortable with, the Ramban was comfortable with. There were hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of other inhabitants of Canaan who spoke the same language on the one hand, and on the other hand, absolute confidence. This is Lashon HaKodesh. This is Roman Tonim Choloshen. This is elevated from other languages. It was molded and morphed into a language of Kedusha. So I'm going to stop here for this week. Next week there is no shir, but Mitzvah Hashem, the week after that there will be a shir again. And next week we will look at another area of discussion, in a way a parallel discussion, which is the font, the lettering that we use in Lashon HaKodesh, which again Chazal tell us was an import from Ashur, and Lashon Ashur. We'll see what the Machlokas, what Lashon Ashur means, and we'll talk about that. And then hopefully the week after that, I hope I'll still manage to finish off the Paul Pesach, we'll look at the beauty and depth of Lashon HaKodesh. And the reason I've given this introduction is to say that when we hear Torah around the meaning of words, we need to know that this is not getting caught up, whether you're a Maimonidean, whether you are a proponent of that, however you live your Yiddishkeit. Obviously, we can't take sides in these machlokas. This is we don't choose between Malcolm. We simply understand and try and understand the different approaches. Whatever speaks to you, we can all marvel at the wisdom and depth and beauty and insight and lessons and Kedusha of Lashon HaKodesh, and that's what we'll do in Mitzvah Hashem the week after that. So that's the program for the next few weeks. Hopefully preparation for Pesach, when we will then be able to say from Tonim Choloshen with a little depth of understanding. So I'll start there today.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zobin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you as always.
Thank you.